Hi, I'm Rob Cooper, Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at Temple University and the Tyler School of Art and Architecture. The following presentation I gave on Saturday, March 18th in San Antonio, Texas, where the Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture convened for their 2023 conference. Before I get into the slides, there are 2 points that I heard while attending the conference that I think are relevant. The first was by Joe Nassauer, who said that to advance sustainability and equity, landscape architectural scholars must reform scholarly norms. Now, when she gave her keynote speech for the Lifetime Achievement Award, she was not referring to what I'm about to talk about. Nonetheless, it is still relevant because it deals with scholarly norms, in particular, attending conferences annually. The second was given by President Chang, and that is that an upcoming climate action plan or an upcoming strategic plan for CELA, which will focus on the timeframe of 2025 to 2030, will include climate action as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. Before I get into the presentation, I want to acknowledge the efforts of Youssef, who was an architectural graduate and is an architectural graduate at Temple University, and he's now studying at Drexel University. Youssef helped early on in this project with data collection and entry. Over the last 35 years, CELA has convened in every region of the contiguous United States, as well as British Columbia, China, the Netherlands, and New Zealand. From what I gathered in conference proceedings and conference reviews in Landscape Journal, the number of institutions, at least over the last decade or so, has remained relatively stable, but the number of presentations and authors recorded in proceedings has increased and stabilized. This is only possible, these last two slides, because of aircraft. In 2012, Bill McKibben may have been one of the first to popularize the idea of a carbon budget. And he stated that we had 565 gigatons of carbon dioxide that we could burn while staying under the limit of 2 degrees C warming. But over the last 10 years, we've continued to burn at approximately the same rate, and we've exhausted much of that budget. We now have about 170 gigatons of carbon dioxide left, which could last us 4 years and 9 months. However, if you look at other figures, particularly from Carbon Brief, we have possibly up to 7 years. We are fast approaching tipping points, and there is no evidence or little evidence that emissions are slowing and certainly not decreasing, but we do need to act and act urgently to address and try and minimize the most severe consequences of climate change. In 2018, the IPCC recommended emissions reductions of 45% by 2030 relative to 2010 and 100% by 2050. I will be using these targets, in particular the 2030 target, as I examine potential conference models in the future. Also in this report, they stated that a rapid, far-reaching transition that yields deep emission reductions is needed. And this cuts across all sectors, including academia and conferences each year. And then in a more recent 6th assessment report, they stated that every ton of carbon dioxide emissions adds to global warming. Everything counts. In this article, there are a number of percentages of the German population, the same in Taiwan and in UK, as well as the US, and globe do not fly. So flying is something that a minority of the population participates in. And if you look at the percentage of US American adults, the minority there is responsible for a large majority of the emissions associated with the aviation industry. 2010, Václav Smil released a book called Prime Movers of Globalization, within which he showed, for instance, that the mass power ratio of gas turbine jet engines is incomparable to anything else that is currently being developed in the near or short term. He also showed, for example, that the volumetric and gravimetric energy density of aviation kerosene jet fuel is unmatched and is, quote, highly unlikely to be replaced by anything else in the near future. He also looked at biofuels, synjet fuels, and hydrogen, and all of them have their physical limitations, which make it highly unlikely that they are to be replaced. In 2016, Peters and others released this article wherein they looked at some of the things that were discussed in popular media, including aircraft, body modifications, alternative powers, and alternative fuels. And they concluded that all of these things, based on what was actually happening in the aviation industry, are myths that are delaying effective climate policy. So in sum, there is no possibility, or very little possibility in the near future, of carbon neutral aviation. We need to instead focus on the social or behavioral changes that need to be made, rather than relying upon the highly unlikely transition to a carbon neutral aviation industry. We've got to change our behaviors. As I get into the methods, I'm going to be talking about radiative forcing index factors, otherwise known as RFI, particularly over 100 years. So aircraft emit a number of greenhouse gases. The most well-known, of course, is carbon dioxide. It lingers in the atmosphere the longest, but among the other gases, some of which have a cooling effect and a warming effect, the net effect is positive and has been so within the last 24 years. They've known about this. Currently, we're looking at a net positive warming effect of about 1.7 to 3, depending on the time horizon. So focusing on carbon dioxide is a lot like focusing on soda when you have a terrible, terrible diet. You're failing to account for the entire impact, and as a consequence, you're less inclined to act urgently and act effectively to reduce the impact. I looked at 6 CELA conferences over the last decade or so. They're shown here highlighted in yellow. So there's one virtual, one on each coast, one in the Pacific, the Mountain West, the Midwest, and the Plains. I performed 2 methods to estimate the emissions from past conferences. The first used emission rates from Young, Bluth, and Maley in 2019, and Great Circle distances. So these do not account for aircraft connections at various airports. And I made some assumptions based upon the different possible modes of travel and distances using references that I found in peer-reviewed literature. The second method I used did account for connections at airports, and I visited kayak.com to see where the possible connections or the most likely connections or common connections occurred between where the conference is convened and authors' origins. And then I used those routes and entered them into the ICAO carbon emissions calculator and multiplied those by RFI factors from Lee and others. Lee's been an expert in the field for the last 2 decades. What I found looking at the past conferences over 6 years is that authors who presented more than once accounted for 72% of presentations. If you factor in authors that presented once and twice, that accounts for over 92% of presentations. Now, given that the presentations are requested to be 10 minutes in length, or actually maybe about 15 minutes in length, so each author that presented is present for 15 to 30 minutes actively at the conference. And while I recognize that conferences have numerous benefits, interacting with others, meeting people that you've never met before, hearing from others, having side conversations, seeing various places, this is a big impact, a long-lasting legacy of emissions for 15 to 30 minutes of presentation time each conference. And of course, we know, having gone through the COVID crisis, that these presentations can occur online and can occur effectively. The number of institutions varied. Shown on the left, you have a number of people who presented once and likely didn't present again, at least representing the same institution across the 6 conferences that I reviewed. On the other end, on the right, you've got a number of institutions, universities in particular, that have numerous authors that present frequency. And then you have the composition of authors in different regions and the number of mean authors within those regions. What this is indicating is if we have a conference in one region, say for instance, Texas, like the 2023 conference, then all the authors and the institutions they represent are traveling from these various institutions to one place. And again, this can only happen with aircraft, and as a consequence, it increases emissions because of those aircraft. The sum of emission rates, we see that on the left, the talks and authors didn't vary a whole lot, although I didn't perform a statistical analysis to see if there were significant differences. But if we're focused on RFI factors, we see that the 2019 Sacramento conference had the highest emissions output, whereas the 2015 and 2012 Champaign and Manhattan conferences had the lowest overall. And these patterns also resulted with the author's mean travel-related emissions. Notice that the virtual conference emission was the lowest. So, to put some of these numbers in perspective, the author's mean travel-related emission weight approximated, without RFI factors, the per capita emissions of one resident in Haiti or Uganda. When you factor in RFI factors, that's equal to one resident of Burundi or Comoros. Burundi is in Central Africa and Comoros is off the eastern coast of Africa. The global warming potential over 100 years from these travel-related emissions from each BAU CELA conference equaled this many per capita emissions of residents in Mexico. And across these 5 BAU CELA conferences, this many total residents of Mexico. Travel-related emissions across these 5 CELA conferences, the BAU conferences in the study, also had economic and ecological impacts. So, in total, they may equal or contribute to September Arctic sea ice loss equal to 1 or 2.5 football fields, and labor productivity losses in equatorial lower income regions of the Earth that rely upon mining, construction, agriculture, and other labor outdoors between these dollar figures. So the idea behind it is, as it gets hotter, the harder it is to work outdoors, and the more likely you are to suffer from heat exhaustion. Therefore, you work less and you make less. Compare that to the 2021 virtual conference labor productivity losses that may be equal to between a dime and 50 cents over 100 years. Now, some people might find these numbers uncomfortable because I'm trying to draw connections or relationships between refereed scientific findings, metrics, and the emissions associated with CELA conference. I understand that, and I'm not saying that correlation results in causation, but there is an impact on what we do as an organization and as individuals. To further illustrate the potential impact of trying to sequester or capture the emissions that are already emitted in the atmosphere and lingering from aviation at least. If we're just focused on fuel burn, so this is without RFI, for the 6 CELA conferences in this study, you'd have to plant and ensure the year-long survival of between 37 and 48,000 sugar maple trees. That's cumulative. And if you wanted to plant them in a 10-inch square quincunx pattern across 48 to 61 acres, that's what it would result in that much area. But on average, each CELA conference would require anywhere from 75 to 9,600 sugar maples planted on 7 to 9 acres. That's a lot. So it seems a little easier just to try and find an alternative means of convening. And that's what I set out to do next. In future conferences, so I looked at a couple different methods. First of all, the cities listed at the top, Salt Lake City, Baltimore, etc., are 6 cities that I selected because they are close to active CELA member schools and airports that have numerous connections. I took the mean number of authors across the 6 conferences, which is 446 authors. And then I, first of all, subtracted the 10, 25, and 50% most distant authors from that, thinking that we would, as shown in some literature, incentivize these individuals to attend virtually. I don't think this is the best idea, but it's still worth pursuing to see, it's worth exploring to see what sort of emissions reductions might result. So comparing that to the BAU mean, minimum, and max values, you see those scenarios highlighted in yellow would meet the 2030 target of 45% emissions reduction as defined by the IPCC. Just to give you a little bit more idea and detail regarding methods, I found the latitude and longitude of each CELA member institution that was represented and include the total sums of authors throughout the time period I looked at, as well as the mean number of authors, and then used Excel to calculate the great circle distance between those institutions and the various airport options, and identified the lowest distance as the ideal hub location for that particular institution, and then multiplied that by the emission rate in Jungbluth and Meili, and was able to then identify the mode of travel that's likely to occur based upon that distance and the assumptions I pointed out earlier. In doing so, I identified 2, 3, and 4 interior or coastal combinations of cities and picked those that had the lowest emissions, and then visualized those at 2 through 6 hubs and the various transport modes and how those change. This is a summary overall. So shown on the left in the salmon color are the business as usual conferences and the emissions that I looked at. And then in blue in the center are the various models or scenarios that incentivize the most distant authors to attend virtually. And on the right, we have in green the multi-hub models. Of particular interest should be the orange dashed line in the center, which is the 45% emissions reduction by 2030 that IPCC recommended. And here is virtual, almost zero. So again, I want to remind everyone that every ton of carbon dioxide emissions adds to global warming. Hopefully I've tried to illustrate that regarding the loss of September Arctic sea ice, labor productivity losses, and the number of trees and area that would be needed to sequester an equivalent quantity of carbon dioxide emissions from travel only. And keep in mind that conference also requires emissions from travel to and from airports and other modes of transport, food, and venues, as well as electricity, heating, cooling, and so forth. And that we need a rapid, far-reaching transition that yields these deep emissions reductions. We've got to act, and we've got to act now. The sooner, the better. So to conclude, I have a few recommendations, for which the first is biannual conferences would immediately have CELA conference-related travel emissions, roughly. We could even go every 3 years. And as one of my colleagues suggested, perhaps if we were to meet every 2 or 3 years, we could extend the conference and make it a more worthwhile venture each year to really savor the time that we have together in person. And that might be an opportunity to transition to one of these other recommendations, such as the virtual attendance by at least 25% of the most distant registrants. Now, I think this isn't ideal among the recommendations I'm providing here, because it's inequitable. Those people who do attend virtually only are not getting the same experience as the people who attend in person. They can't have those conversations, informal conversations off to the side and outside of sessions, and they have a smaller chance of having their questions voiced and heard. So the engagement is going to be different in comparison to some of the other options like the biannual, triannual conferences, or to convene in person in at least 3 hubs that are connected virtually. This is the multi-hub conference option. Finally, no offsets, carbon offsets or carbon credits. A growing body of refereed literature shows have been ineffective because they do not, it's very difficult to verify that they are permanent, and then they meet the important criteria of additionality. So there's no assurance that they actually reduce or sequester the emissions that are actually emitted into the atmosphere. Moreover, in the November 2022 Integrity Matters report released by the UN, they clearly state that non-state actors cannot buy cheap credits that often lack integrity, instead of immediately cutting their own emissions across the value chain. Additionally, non-state actors cannot focus on reducing the intensity of their emissions rather than their absolute emissions. So, for instance, focusing on the mean author's travel-related emissions instead of the overall emissions. That's what we've got to focus on. That's what's important. So this report is otherwise known as the greenwashing report. Here's a few resources which I can share as well for some of the literature that continues to come out about flying less in academia. The Atari article has to do with the credibility of the messengers about climate change and how that might impact our perception or others' perception of us as environmentalists, as people who care about the environment and purport to be green. And then the other articles really are about implementing alternative means of convening each year, some of which are detailed. Parnkit's articles are particularly detailed and would serve as wonderful resources for making that transition to a multi-hub conference. I thank you. Please email me if you have any questions. I really enjoy the opportunity to discuss this further in greater detail and implement something soon that will get us on a more sustainable future.